If I asked ChatGPT to tell me the live flight status of a flight that's like currently in the air, the GPT model wasn't necessarily trained on the data for a flight that is currently happening. For GPT to be able to get that data, it would need to somehow fetch that data from the internet somewhere and then use it as part of its response. And that's where functions comes in. Here's how it works. So to take that example, first, a user would ask a question to an assistant. For example, when does a certain flight arrive? Using that prompt, the assistant would then be able to understand that it needs to call that function. From the prompt that it was provided, it would then identify the necessary parameters that we would need to call that function. So in this example, where we're trying to get live flight data, that parameter could be something like a flight number. After that, the function could then be called using the parameters that the GPT model had identified. Again, using our example, our function to fetch live flight data would be invoked using the flight number parameter that's been passed from the assistant. That function could be written and hosted by us on a cloud server anywhere. It could literally be written using any language whatsoever. Once that function has then been invoked, we can then pass the function's response back to the assistant, where the assistant can then use that data to create a response. Hopefully that gives you a rough idea as to how assistants work, so let's see an example of how it works. So this is a little app that I've built using OpenAI Assistant and Streamlit, and the way that it works is exactly as we just described. It fetches live flight details from a server and then uses it as part of the AI model's responses. So I'm going to ask, when is the expected landing time for flight number VS3? And now we have a response. The flight with number VS3 has already landed. It arrived on November 12, 2023 at 11:28 a.m. UTC. And that is data that was fetched from today. Let's try a different question. What is the name of the airline for flight number VS3? The airline for flight number VS3 is Virgin Atlantic. Again, entirely correct. And so step by step, I'm now going to walk through every single step that was required to build that little app. So first and foremost, nothing too exciting. We just create ourselves an OpenAI client in Python. So I will run that right now. And we are going to pass in our OpenAI key to initialize it. In the next step, we are declaring an assistant ID. Now, there are two different ways that you can create this assistant. One of the ways is using that OpenAI client that we actually just created in the previous step and write it in code. The other way, which I found nice and user-friendly, is to actually use the OpenAI platform. If you log into platform.openai, you can then click on the assistants button on the left side of the screen and it will bring up all of your assistants. And from there, you can hit the create button in the top right-hand corner and create your first assistant. As you can see, I've actually already created a couple of assistants here, but the one that we care about is this one called Flight Assistant. So let's take a look at that. So I've created a flight assistant, I've called it Flight Assistant, and then we have the assistant ID here, which is what I was referencing to in our Jupyter notebook. Following that, I've given it some instructions. So you are a helpful assistant. If you are asked about a flight, use the flight number with the provided get flight details function to get information about the flight, then answer the user's question with that data exclusively. So pretty self-explanatory. I'm using the GPT 3.5 model here, mainly just because it's a bit cheaper and it does everything that I need it to do. And then the important part to get our functions working is I've actually added a function here called getFlightDetails. And if we click through to that, we can see some information about it. So this JSON object that you can see on the screen here is ultimately a way of telling your OpenAI assistant exactly what the function is and how it works. The assistant ultimately needs to have an understanding as to how the function works because of two reasons. Number one is it needs to understand when to call that function. You could just have a conversation with the flight assistant about something entirely different. You wouldn't necessarily want that function to be called with every single prompt, for example. And the other part of this is the assistant needs to understand exactly which parameters it needs to pull out of the prompts that it's been given to then pass into the function. So in our instance, it's the flight number. This little object here will ultimately give the assistant everything that it needs to know. So we have a name, we have a description, which is just get details about a flight. We pass in an object for parameters, which is going to have flight numbers as a property. The type is going to be a string, and the description is going to be the flight number. We've specified that we want the flight number to be a required parameter because without that, we won't be able to get the flight details. If you are building your first one, you would like a template, you can click on this little examples button in the top right hand corner and then choose on get weather or get stock as a starting point. And so with that said, that's actually all that's required to set up the assistant from the platform side. So we can now head back over to our Visual Studio Code instance and go from there. So this next step is going to be entirely different based off of whatever your OpenAI Assistant does. This step for me specifically is a little function which is responsible for taking a flight number, getting the live flight data, and then getting and then returning a string back with a bunch of information about that flight in it. And so in this chunk of code, all that we are doing is taking that flight number and then getting that live flight data from it. And then from here, we are actually just getting the landing date, the estimated landing date, and the airline, just so that we have them as strings, and then putting them into one string that we can then pass to our GPT model. So in this case, we return a string which says, here is some information about flight, and then flight number, the airline name is airline, the flight status is X, the flight's estimated arrival time is Y, and the flight did land at Z. Now, I've just pulled out a couple of little bits of information because I know the kind of questions that I'm going to be asking, but there's no reason you couldn't extend this out and add more metadata if you wanted to be able to answer more questions. So with that said, I'm just going to hit play so that you can see exactly what happens when we call the get flight details function on VS3. The airline name is Virgin Atlantic, the flight status is landed, and we have the estimated arrival time and the actual arrive time. Next, all we need to do is just to fetch our assistant using the client. So I'm just going to go client assistance retrieve and then just pass in the assistant ID. And then I'm going to log the assistant and we can see that that has come through exactly as we'd expected. Following that, we are having a brand new conversation with our assistant. So we're going to create a brand new thread. Next, I'm going to perform an example run on our assistant. So I've gone ahead and created a new run using client beta threads run create and passed in the thread ID that we just created in the previous step. I'm going to pass in the assistant ID, which was created in retrieved from the step before that. And then I'm going to pass in the instructions, which is just when is flight AA733 arriving? And that is ultimately the question that you want to ask your assistant. So let's hit play so that we can have a look at that run. Now that run has been created, if we look at the completed app property on that run, we can see that it says none. That means that right now our run hasn't finished. It might need some more information. And to check that, we can actually just go ahead and retrieve that run again. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit play on here and retrieve our run. And this time we actually get quite a lot more information back. Now, when we fetch that run again, you can see that there is a required action property that's been populated. Now, this object basically has all the information in that is needed to be able to call that function that we just created earlier to get the latest flight deals. So you can have a little look in detail. You can actually see that the function that it wants to call is get flight details, which is correct. That is the name that we have specified for the get flight details function. And then you can see the arguments that it wants to pass that function are flight number with the value AA733, which is perfect. The GPT model has extrapolated from the prompt, which is when is flight AA733, that it needs to call the get flight details function and it needs to pass it the flight number parameter with the value set as AA733. So now it's up to us to basically take that request and call our function. So to be able to call that function to provide that data to the assistant, we can just grab the tool calls object from the run using run.requiredAction submit tool outputs tool calls. Now the reason that there are multiple tool calls in this example is because our assistant is actually capable of calling multiple functions at the same time. For example, if we asked, tell me when flights VS3, VS4, and VS5 are going to get in and which one is going to get there first, to be able to do that, it would need to call that get flight details function 3 times. And so in this case, or in that case, sorry, the tool calls array would consist of 3 separate function calls. In our example though, the tool calls array is just going to be filled with 1 request because we've only asked for information for 1 flight. And so we're going to iterate over all of those required calls, which in our case is just going to be the 1, and then we are going to get the required outputs for that function call. So for each one of those function calls, we're going to call this function that I've created called getOutputs for tool call. First, we need to pass the flight number from the payload that has been provided from our OpenAI Assistant. And the way that we do that is we just pass the string that's been passed in from the tool call. So toolcall.function.arguments, and then we're just going to grab the value for the flight number key. And then we just need to get the flight details string from that function that we created earlier on. And to do that, we're just going to declare a variable called flight details, called get flight details, and then we then pass in the flight number that was passed to us from the assistant. And then finally, we return a super simple object that we can then pass back to our assistant to then be able to use as part of its response. So I'm just going to hit play on this and we can then see the output. So we have tool call ID and then the call, the function call that we needed. And then we can see the output, which is here's some information about flight AA73. So that output is then going to be passed to our assistant to then use as part of its response. So now that we've created that object, or objects if there were multiple functions that needed to be called for a single query, we can now pass those outputs back to our assistant using this block here. So I'm just going to run client beta threads run and then submit tool outputs, which is all of the outputs that we just generated. And we're going to pass in the thread ID of the thread that we created earlier, the run ID, again, the run that we've been using this entire time. And we're just going to pass the tool outputs, which is an array of all of the objects that we've returned from this get outputs for tool call. So if I hit play on this, and we can now see that the run status is now queued as it uses that data that we've just passed to it to then generate a new reply. Next, we can then just call threads.run.retrieve to fetch the run again, just to check on the status and see how it's getting on. We can now see that the status is completed, which means that the message should be generated. And so the only thing that we need to do here is use the client beta threads.message.list and just grab the latest message in our thread to see exactly what the response was. So if I hit play, we can now see that the value is flight AA73 has already landed. It arrived at its destination on November 12, 2023. So that is the correct response that is using the live flight data function that we invoked ourselves using information that we passed to the assistant. And that's really all there is to it. If you enjoyed watching this video, please do let me know down in the comments, and I would love to know if you have anything else that you would love to see me create. I'm really enjoying making these AI kind of tutorials and would love to get into some more deeper kind of subjects. So please just let me know what kind of thing you would like to see and I'll do my best to make it. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.